Hi, everyone. Welcome to Food Talk Live. A reminder that this episode will also appear on Food Tank's podcast, Food Talk with Danny Nierenberg. So please sign up wherever you listen to podcasts. Today, I get to chat with Pekka Pesonen, the Secretary General of Copa-Cogeca, the largest lobbying group for farmers and farmers cooperatives in the European Union. The organization represents the interests of over 70 agriculture groups. I want to thank you so much for joining me today, Pekka, from Brussels. I know it's getting into evening there and you probably want to go home, so I'm really glad to see you. Before we begin, I just want to make sure that you and your colleagues and all of your family are sort of safe and healthy during this crazy time.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and we are all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed in Brussels.
That's good to hear. That's good to hear. So before we begin, I'm hoping you can sort of give a short overview of what Copa-Cogeca does and who you represent in Europe.
We represent national farmers organizations all across the EU 27 now. We still have very strong links with the NFU, National Farmers Union in UK, and we are here for the EU institutions. It's very much about European Commission, European Council of Ministers, and European Parliament. And together with our member organizations, we lobby for European farmers, which is about 10 million strong group of farmers, together with other operators in the food chain, all the way to 40 million people plus in agri-food chain, and our 22,000 agricultural cooperatives. And if you make a comparison, we work slightly differently than in the US. We are pan-European organization. We are supranational, that organization that lobbies for its members on a binding legislation of the EU. So in this respect, we are somewhat different than the federal organizations in the US, and we are quite unique internationally also.
Absolutely. And so can you describe the farmers who you're representing? Is it small farmers, medium-sized farmers, big farmers, or all three?
All of them. In all member states, we have a huge range of farmers, and their conditions are different, their sizes are different, their production methods, even within the same sectors, they are very much different. They have also, which is a very characteristics for the European Union agriculture, is that the historic background is different. And for instance, Central Eastern European member states still have to cope with the let's say, the land reforms that were imposed on them in 1940s, and the consequences we still see in the EU policymaking. And that's just an observation. We don't have a political orientation whatsoever. I think the common denominator for our policy action is that we try to support, sustain our agricultural activities and our farmers as much as possible. And it's really important for us also to involve cooperatives in this respect, because that means that we bring the agricultural goods increasingly to the market according to the market conditions and in relation to the consumer preference. And in this respect, cooperatives are very important. I have a very strong cooperative background myself from my native Finland, mainly in dairy industry. But then we certainly believe that the farmers joining forces, the marketplace, would make a huge difference for themselves and their families.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, this support for farmers that you provide and farmers cooperatives, I can imagine that's only become more and more important during the COVID-19 pandemic. Can you describe sort of what your strategy has been to help farmers during this really critical time?
Well, the first lesson actually that we learned from this crisis was the importance of the single market, the EU internal market that operates without borders. And the negative consequences or the negative experiences we had are very much linked with that. Some member states had to make decisions, for instance, on free movement of people. They had to limit that, restrict, and even if they didn't target trade or agricultural trade, the consequence for agricultural trade was visibly seen immediately. So that the border controls put in place actually slowed down the trade, and the consequences was felt all across the EU immediately.
And what kind of consequences? What kind of consequences are we talking about?
One very, very new, like a new phenomena that we haven't experienced so far was free movement of labor. And unfortunately, we just entered this crisis in the very beginning of our seasons, agricultural seasons, especially for fruit and veg. And we experience a lot of difficulties in having access to seasonal labor force within the EU borders and also with third countries. And this became a very concrete, real problem in many member states, and especially in sectors such as fruit and vegetable, but increasingly other sectors too.
How big is the seasonal labor force for the EU? How many people are we talking about?
We have millions of people that work part-time or sometime during the season in European agriculture. But then we tend to say that we, roughly speaking, have almost 1 million annual labor unit, if I may use the measurement in that sense, that equivalent to people that work full-time for a year. But then this means that we have millions of people that work part of the year. So it may be like 3 months a year, and we have several million people that do this, let's say, once a year for a local farm or to a farm in a neighboring country. And so it's a steep involvement of other societal groups to European agriculture, but in this case on the seasonal basis.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we're all beginning to realize how important those seasonal laborers are in the food system. I think it's something that, you know, a lot of folks in the United States have not quite understood until now, how important those seasonal workers are and how important they are to making sure that we're all fed. You mentioned this, the slowed down trade, and I'm wondering if that has led to more food loss and food waste because farmers are not able to distribute their products.
Well, we certainly had that, and we tried to fight that as much as we can, because it really is not in the interest of the farming community to have food losses, because we have made investment into it. There's a lot of work put into it, and if we lose that by some changes in the marketplace or the consumer behavior, we are of course trying to do our very best to offset that, use these biomass, for instance, for other purposes. But then of course we experienced, especially in the fruit and veg, when we didn't have the labor force to harvest certain early vegetables, for instance, asparagus typically, we certainly experienced this, that we actually didn't have the means to harvest this crop that we were planning to sell in the first place. Then we had also, which is actually probably the biggest single change that we had all across the EU, was the closure of the HoReCa sector, hotels, restaurants, and catering. And that consequently meant that 10 to 15% in some member states of the food supply was lost on a short-term basis, because there were no outlets for these volumes anymore. And the same produce couldn't be easily sold in the retail outlets because the package size was different, or the composition was the product was different, or they didn't have the labeling. And some of the cash and carry outlets actually came up with initiatives to open the doors to consumers in order to get rid or sell these produce that they couldn't otherwise get rid of. And it was so strange that with the same wholesalers, we may have had a situation where on one part of the business, they were flooded by products that they couldn't sell because the restaurants were closed. And on the other side of the same business, they experienced some shortages in certain product groups that the consumers started buying from the retail outlets. And then, of course, that led to certain losses. And of course, we regret that this has taken place, but there wasn't that much that we could have done.
And what are you hearing from your members? What are their biggest concerns right now?
Well, I think it's very much linked with the market itself, and the changes in consumption patterns have led to a situation that we have lost a big part of the value added, the high price end of the scale. Typically, beef, high value cuts, steaks go unsold because we have most of the restaurants closed. Usually you don't eat that many steaks at home, and so therefore the economic return from the marketplace is somewhat less than before. And this is also on the basis of certain, let's say, high-end products such as specialized cheeses or processed products that have been once again used especially in catering. Also high quality wine has suffered a bit, At least some of our producers, our members, have reported that they have lost some high quality wine markets, that they simply don't have the same volumes anymore. And going together with the recent, for instance, trade restrictions with the US, that is really hampering our economic situation within the sector. And therefore, we have been calling for the European Commission to come up with the market management measures that still exist in the legislation.
Uh-huh. And what kind of measures would those be?
Well, it depends on the sector. And some sectors have what we call private storage aid, that the operators will be paid certain a small amount of money per month per ton to compensate the storing cost that they may have. Okay. Then, of course, we have issues such as public intervention. For instance, sectors such as milk, we have still public intervention open from March to September. And during this period, the European Commission basically is obliged to buy volumes into public intervention if the price levels go below certain levels. Mm-hmm. And but those levels are so detrimental to most in this case dairy producers that we certainly don't want to go that far. And we would like to, let's say, use other means like promotional measures, private storage aid, or some other aspects. In the past, we used to export, but this is no longer available in the way that we had it in the past.
Right. Which governments do you think are handling the situation for farmers the best right now?
You mean in the EU?
In the EU, yeah.
Well, by definition, the European Commission and European institutions are in charge of the EU agricultural sector and the market management. But of course, we have certain measures that now the Commission itself has given to the member states to help farming community and especially some of the businesses. And I would like to draw as an example. It's still very much in the process, so we can't say what's going to happen at the end. But I know that, for instance, the Dutch and the Belgian governments have been, let's say, in talks with their respective farming organizations in order to intervene to certain businesses that have experienced hardship. And one of the sectors that, strangely enough, has also come forward and has been impacted by this has been flowers and ornamentals. And even though you can't talk about foodstuffs in this respect directly, but then indirectly, for instance, nurseries are affected. So that, for instance, a vegetable sector would require some plants for their season, and we need to sustain these businesses so that they can actually make a contribution, or at least partially, to foodstuff sectors too. So we have seen some initiatives in member states, but you could imagine that in the times of COVID-19, and especially with the general economic downturn, it's been increasingly difficult for the member states to intervene. And so therefore we have called for European institutions to recognize that agriculture is a strategically important sector, more or less in the same line with the US federal government has said. Sure. You have a different political system in the US, but then we certainly took notice that the Trump administration declared a rescue package for the US agriculture. And we certainly would hope that European Union would do, if not exactly the same, but would recognize the importance of agriculture sector as a part of the recovery and how we should come out of the crisis from market point of view, and then also for future investment for agriculture.
Sure. I mean, there's no greater essential worker than a farmer, I think, during this time. So the more that can be done to support farmers and help them do their jobs better during this crisis, I mean, I think the better off we'll all be. There's no question about that. You know, we've been talking in the United States about how small and medium-sized farmers have really had to pivot and change a lot of their practices. You know, farmers markets have been closed. You know, they don't have the distribution that you mentioned before to restaurants that they had before. So they're doing a lot of online marketing. They're developing more CSAs to deliver food directly to people. Do you see that happening with some of your smaller and medium-sized members?
Well, we have seen some development, but we have to keep in mind that we are talking about relatively inexpensive produce, agricultural goods, and infrastructure for this kind of large-scale sales through the internet simply doesn't exist to the extent that we would need now. So therefore, I think it's fair to say that we need to make sure that we function as normal as possible with the existing means. And then parallel to that, in addition to that, of course, we are very much interested in developing other means. And of course, the European Commission also has pointed out that we need to make an assessment how the food chain works. And we have been actively involved with that with other stakeholders. And one particular item that you mentioned was actually the farmers' markets. And we were very happy to see that at least partially the French government lifted their restrictions to farmers' market, because in particular that affected some of the local producers that use that as an outlet to their sales. And you could imagine, once again, if these same producers were to go through their supermarket chains, it would be another hurdle for them. Even though
Absolutely.
We know that some of the supermarkets actually came to rescue and they helped these farmers. But it's more to do with the change in the capacities that exist to enable these producers to sell their produce through other means and channels, rather than if they want it. Of course, they want to do that, and we certainly wouldn't like to enable them to do that. But it can be challenging because of the missing infrastructure.
Absolutely. Do you think the cooperatives that you're working with are coming out better than sort of the individual farmers who belong to different organizations but who are not part of a cooperative?
There's a fundamental difference between the cooperatives and at least some of the private side businesses, and this is that the cooperatives are committed to their members because they are owned by the same farmers. And so, for instance, when it comes to crisis management and especially collection of agricultural goods, by definition, the cooperatives are supposed to do this. Even if the times are tough, they are supposed to act upon on the volumes that their producers, their members, their owners actually produce. And in this respect, I think we saw a very good example in the UK dairy market, where some of the private operators simply informed our members in UK that unfortunately we cannot collect your milk. And this would be unheard of in any cooperative, because then if your own cooperative doesn't come and collect your milk, they better have a good excuse. And so, of course, it may be some physical means that they cannot do that, but as in principle, if you say that, well, sorry, there's no market, we are not going to come and pick your produce up, this is not an option for a corporate. You know, this is also something that we see as an added value for our members, cooperative members, that they can rely on the support of the wider, bigger entity that they are member of, and we see a great value of that.
Well, and it lessens the risk, especially during times like this. It makes, when people are working together, they can, manage that risk collectively. This might be sort of a negative question, but I do think it's worth asking. What's your biggest fear right now for the European farming sector?
I think if you look at the short term, we are quite worried about the economic development during the crisis itself, because this is in the minds of most farmers. Of course, we are looking into the longer term perspective too, but then if you go to any farming community, they are struggling to make the ends meet. They are really fighting to keep the supply of foodstuffs to the process, to the processors, to the retail, to the consumers. And we do this together with other partners in the value chain. And we are very committed to this, so that there's no doubt in our minds that what would be the importance of the food security European style. Usually we have too much to eat, at least I eat too much. But then the reality is that when we had these crises, European consumers went to the supermarkets and they bought pasta, flour, eggs, sugar, UHT milk, and some basic commodities also in fruit and veg. And the shelves went empty. And toilet paper. And which is really strange in the sense that in a fairly high living standard communities, like here in Belgium, we had this reaction. And so the consumers expect that we fulfill the food security needs for themselves, even in a high living standard societies. And this is what we are committed to deliver. So this is the short-term concern, that can we actually sustain this? Can we survive this economically? Can we get the support from the union? Can we get the proper action in place for the short-term needs?
Sure.
Then the second, which is more strategic, which we have seen already coming for a number of years, is the employment or getting young farmers, new entrants to the sector. Because the Commission for Agriculture or European Commission, European institutions may put out declarations that we need to have younger generation, we need to enhance the new entrants. But if they are not there, what can we do? And so therefore, our message to the EU decision makers is that you need to make agriculture economically viable so that our brilliant minds can actually make the investment. And this is the message that we have tried to put across to the European Commission, especially Commissioner in charge of agriculture, Mr. Wojciechowski, that please, whatever you do, just make sure that the decisions are in line with the market so that the young farmers and the farmers can make the investment, irrespective whether it is about sustainable agriculture, more sustainable production in future, but it has to be in line with the market realities, because the tax man is not going to pay more for agriculture in Western world. And this seems to be very difficult to get across. That can we employ modern technologies, innovative technologies? Sometimes they can be controversial in order to make us more resilient, more sustainable, and especially when it comes to the new investment that everybody is talking about so much.
Well, and if you're talking about, making sure that young farmers are supported and that they're, they want to be in farming, a lot of technologies can help them do that. And, not just the controversial ones that I think you're referring to, but, more digital use of more digital technologies that farmers can use, better ways to communicate, better ways to market, better ways to get information about weather and prices and markets. Those are all things that would help young farmers want to become part of the farming sector and the agriculture sector and keep them involved.
I think it's about a combination of the factors that you just mentioned. It's very rarely that we only have a one single solution for especially for the sustainability and economics. It's a combination of various factors. You have to have a superior infrastructure to support you in terms of marketing channels, the expertise from your partners, and then importantly that you get the data, you get the information. And so this is why European farming community as Copa-Cogeca, we have been quite recently active with other stakeholders to come up with a standard for a guideline for the data sharing. Mm-hmm. And this is a crucially important element, because if a young farmer goes into an investment plan, so the first thing the bank manager will most probably ask him or increasingly her is that, so what are you going to sell? How are you going to make your living? Mm-hmm. And so the information from the consumer market, and also going back to the consumer market to show the commitment that the consumers would rely on. And that's why we are very much interested in technologies such as blockchain, because it would provide us for the young farmers or the farmers in general, because increasingly we also have to take note that older people like myself, we may actually be interested in getting into the business. And so therefore, it would be really important that we could rely on the information from the consumers, and ideally, if the consumers are interested in committing themselves, they could make the necessary investment. And this is really crucially important for us. It may also be some of the very physical technologies, like can I reduce my dependence on some particular input? Mm-hmm. And what is in the popular media now to talk about, and it's very much about, for instance, chemical substances. Mm-hmm. But then it's also that how can I combat the phenomena behind this? How can I combat pest and disease that increasingly due to climatic changes are going to pester my crops or my livestock? And so therefore, the common denominator for these investments and new thinking is that you have to have a combination of factors. Mm-hmm. And that's why we are quite confident that we in European agriculture sector, we actually have fairly good image even here in Europe, because the surveys that we have had in the European Commission, they always come on top, that agriculture actually enjoys quite support of the society. And we are quite convinced that after this crisis, this support would be at least as strong. But then it would be also that, can we demonstrate further progress? Can we show this closeness to the consumer concerns? And to a certain extent, we can do this also internationally now, external trade. And we are quite happy to see this developing. And I think in addition to the combination of factors, we also see that diversification of European agriculture in many sense is actually crucially important for us. Absolutely. We can actually deliver whatever the consumers are interested. We don't ask any further questions. We try to deliver what they want.
I get it. I mean, consumers rule, and if they're supportive of small and medium scale farmers as well as large farmers, then they can make a lot of impact. I think it's good, that you brought up to remember that farmers aren't just facing COVID-19 right now. They're facing all of the problems that they were facing before, whether it's climate related or trade restrictions or trade regulations that have either devastated some of their production, or I'm talking about farmers all over the world. So I think it's after this crisis, those farmers will still be facing the same challenges, and they're going to continue to need support from the European Union and our the U.S. government, the governments all over the world. Why I think there's a tendency for governments to have to have forgotten agriculture and to have forgotten farmers. Do you think that this crisis will sort of force them to think more strategically about investing in farmers?
In fact, that question has been put to me several times in the past 13 years that I've been working for the organization as Secretary General. And I've always said that we don't see this situation correcting itself until we have a crisis. And I mean true crisis. But the difficulty for us is that the farming community, no farming community around the world can advocate for a crisis. And now we have this. It came from outside the union, from outside the conventional, let's say, food chain. It had nothing to do with the, let's say, food production, at least from the European perspective, at least according to the information that we have now. And then the farming community is the first casualty of the crisis. Absolutely. So we cannot advocate for this. But I'm quite convinced that now the lessons that we learn are very much linked with the interdependencies within the EU single market, also internationally. And importantly, how can we develop this further? To what extent can we tolerate this dependency? Because I don't want to black paint anybody in particular, but then we are very much dependent on certain inputs on our human lives. For instance, pharmaceuticals. For instance, some of the antibiotics come almost exclusively from, for instance, China. And the question is that the Chinese may do a good job. Well, I'm not asking Mr. Trump, but then we may say that they may do a good job, and that's why they actually supply certain pharmaceuticals, for instance, antibiotics for human health already, not to mention veterinary pharmaceuticals. Sure. The question is that how much do we want to be dependent on these single suppliers in the future? How much should we build our own kind of capacities? How much are we prepared to pay for it? And this is the crucial element here, especially here in Europe, because irrespective of this, what we call added value, and the consumers are increasingly interested in, the thing is that they always go back to the price. And so therefore, how can we maintain our competitiveness in a new situation where we need to take a look into how we produce our foodstuffs? And how dependent are we on some single items? It is linked with the food chain and how long the food chain would be. But I'm absolutely convinced that European farmers are professional people. They are trained increasingly, they have education, and they can relate to these things. But fundamentally, what are we going to learn from these crises in order to be better prepared for the next crisis that obviously eventually will be there? I hope not, and we will do everything in our powers to stop it. For instance, animal disease. We are very motivated to make sure that we wouldn't have the spread of the disease any further. But then the reality is that we need to be prepared for this. We need to prevent, and this prevention is a crucially important thing when we talk about how to prepare ourselves for the next round.
Absolutely. Certainly lots of lessons to be learned from COVID-19 for, crises that we'll be facing in the future, whether it's climate change or the spread of zoonotic diseases, etc. I want to end on sort of a hopeful note. And I know you get to work with so many sort of amazing farmers and farmers unions and farmers groups and cooperatives. Who is inspiring you the most right now? Who is sort of keeping you going during this critical time?
Well, this is, as you could imagine, this is always a bit sensitive issue to answer for multinational organization or European organization like ours. But I have to, on a serious note, I have to give credit and I have to show my respect to the Italian and the Spanish farming communities, and especially to start with the North Italy farming communities that were really hard hit by the COVID-19. That was devastating to these farming families with the probably huge losses of their loved ones. It seriously restricted their action, their livelihoods, their lives, and some of them actually endured the ultimate loss, losing their own lives or their family lives. This really makes my heart, let's say, break. And my appreciation, my respect would go to my Italian and Spanish farmers that also have had a hard time in their livelihoods. But then I'm absolutely convinced that like Italian farmers and the farming community in the past, they will come on top of this crisis. But it would require investment, hard work, and we will certainly support our members in doing that.
Yes, I agree. Farmers, if nothing else, are resilient and they will persevere in Spain and in Italy and elsewhere in the world. I think that was a wonderful note to end on. You can find more information at copa-cogeca.eu. And if you want more information, we'll also have Pekka's bio and other information about his organizations on our website, foodtank.com. Thanks so much for joining me today, Pekka. I really appreciate your insight into the European context. I hope everyone will join me back here at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time when I'll be interviewing Jeff Gordonier from Esquire magazine. Thank you so much, Pekka. Please stay well.
Thank you very much. Stay healthy and eat European good food.
Thank you. Bye. Take care.